In this lecture, I want to give an introduction to jQuery. This is going to be an opportunity to just give you the idea about what jQuery is about and a little bit about the lead-in to the different things that you can do with it. jQuery is really an enormous library, and you can spend quite a lot of time getting very familiar with it and becoming an expert with it. What we're interested in is developing an understanding of it that will work for rapid prototyping. We don't need to be a super expert at it, but we should be able to recognize it when it's being used. And if we need to use it for our prototypes, we need to be at least familiar enough that we're able to manipulate some of the elements of it. Although maybe we won't be able to become a complete expert, or we don't want to become a complete expert for whatever career path we're heading down. So this is Intro to jQuery, and I'm Professor Don Patterson. The high-level thing that I want to communicate in this lecture is that JavaScript is a way to add interactivity to web pages, and jQuery makes this easier by providing a simple syntax and really powerful actions that manipulate the document object model, or DOM. Now, if you recall, the general idea for how we were framing the different languages that build up and become a web application were in three areas: an area of content, presentation, and interactivity. The content was dictated by HTML. This was the tag-based language formed out of XML, theoretic XML, although it doesn't exactly follow the syntax of XML. Opening and closing tags, they're nested, and because of that, the structure of HTML forms a tree. When we start to look at that tree in a browser, when we start to manipulate that tree as a data object, then we call it the document object model, and it becomes the content that we begin to work with and that the browser displays in the window when it's loaded that HTML. On the other hand, that content is separated from the way in which it's presented. And in order to separate those things out, there's a separate language called CSS, which we've looked at, that applies different formatting to the different elements of our document object model. Maybe a paragraph has a particular font. Maybe a headline, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, have different font weights or different coloring depending on what our document looks like. Maybe we have background colors and we have outline bullets that look different ways. And all that can be styled within CSS. HTML has one language, CSS has a slightly different language, but they're both manipulating the same web page. Finally, we've been looking at the way in which we can add interactivity to the web page by including JavaScript. Up till now, we've used a lot in some of our demos. We haven't talked a lot about it. We've done a little bit of tutorial on it. And in this lecture, when we talk about jQuery, what we're talking about is adding more powerful ability to do interactivity to JavaScript. jQuery is a subset of JavaScript. It is a JavaScript library. So it fits neatly in that interactivity sphere. So what is jQuery exactly? Well, it's a JavaScript library, and some of the characteristics of it are that it is cross-browser. Now, if you're new to JavaScript programming, or maybe you've been trying to do JavaScript programming without jQuery, you may realize that there are very subtle but annoying differences between different browsers. HTML that renders one way in a browser made by Microsoft will render another way in a browser made by Chrome versus another way in the Safari browser or mobile browsers. Very frustrating to have the same HTML not actually produce the same results, or CSS or JavaScript, or the combination of them. One of the great things that jQuery gives us is it gives us a custom, not a custom interface, it provides an interface to doing some of the things that you could do in JavaScript, but you would get different results in different platforms. One of the things that jQuery did is they took the programmers behind jQuery took the responsibility for making sure that when you made a call to a jQuery library, they would do whatever it needed to be done in order to make sure that the result would be the same on all the different browsers that it supports. Huge time savings if you're doing HTML manipulation through jQuery. It also is free. Now in English we have the word free, and unfortunately that conflates two different ideas. The idea of something being no cost or $0, and the idea of something supporting liberty or freedom. So we in English say it's free as in beer and free as in speech. But in other languages, Romance languages, there's usually two different words that represent these different ideas of free. So Spanish, we would have the word of libre, and gratis for the first one, gratis being it doesn't cost anything, and the second one being that it's freedom. When we talk about free or open source software, we're primarily talking about the second one, that it's free as in freedom, because the ability to look at the source code gives us confidence that the program that we're running does what we expect it to do and nothing else. So jQuery is free. It's actually free in both senses, beer and speech. jQuery supports a number of different things. Some of the primary things that it supports, excuse me. Some of the primary things it supports are manipulating the HTML elements or the document object model. It supports animations, transitioning the presentation of different elements. It supports event handling, for example, adding the ability to react to clicks or mouse events that are associated with different objects on your HTML page. And it also supports AJAX, which stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And what that means is it supports the ability to go out and get other information from other web resources. We're not going to use that much in this class, although it's powerful. So now, in order to get jQuery into your website, it takes a little bit of work. You can't just write JavaScript that calls jQuery without first loading it as a library. You have to load it. Where are you going to load it from? Well, you have a lot of options. Because it's open source, you can download it to your own machine. So in our demo, we would end up putting that in the public/JS directory if we wanted to download it ourselves. And you could get it from jQuery.com. Another thing that you could do is you could load it remotely within your HTML from Google. Well, why might you want to do this? Why would you leverage Google's copy of jQuery if you can download it yourself? Well, one reason you might want to do that is because you actually leverage browser caching. If several different websites that an end user visits all happen to use jQuery, and all of those sites use jQuery from Google, then it's going to look the same to the browser. It's going to look like the same resource to the browser, and it's not going to have to download it again. And so if you get the resource from Google, it's actually going to appear like jQuery is downloaded really, really fast because it happens to be there from visiting another website. So that's an advantage of using Google's resource for it. The downside of that is that you have to make sure you have network access to Google in order to have access to the jQuery functions. Usually not a problem, but occasionally that can be a stumbling block. And then finally, you could possibly get it from someone else's machine besides Google, some kind of content delivery network. You could load it remotely from the jQuery site itself. All those are perfectly fine possibilities. The website that you're going to go to is jQuery.com, and just for a visual, it kind of looks like this, like this one behind me when you load it up. All right, loading jQuery is just like loading a remote JavaScript. So here's an example of a HTML document, very simple. It has a head and a body, and in the body is just the text "Hello World." In the head section, we don't have a title, which is required according to the W3C, but we have a script tag, which is going to load a script called step5.js. So that JavaScript file, step5.js, is a remote load. But in this case, it's being loaded from a separate file that's still on the same machine in which we're located. When the browser encounters this line, it's going to go out and make a networked resource call to gather that JavaScript, and it's going to bring it into this document object model and evaluate it before proceeding on. You can also see down in the bottom there's an onload attribute for the body tag, which has a little bit of JavaScript present, which says message. And presumably that message function is inside the step5.javascript file. Now, another thing that you could do, rather than loading it from your own machine, is you could load it from Google. And so here's an example of loading an older version of jQuery from Google's, basically their content delivery network. And so in this case, you can see that the SRC, or the source attribute for the script tag, doesn't reference a file locally, but it references a full URL for a resource that's located on Google's computers. And in this case, we're loading two files. We're loading jQuery.min.js and jQuery.ui.min.js. So what do those mean? Well, jQuery has broken down at various points its functionality into two different files to minimize the load time, because perhaps you're using jQuery in such a way that you don't need all of the functions of the user interface support that it provides. in which case you could just download jQuery.js. If you need the full package, actually jQuery has quite a number of different kind of sub-libraries that you might want to load separately just to keep the overall amount of time that it takes your web page to load down to a minimum. Now, if you see that MIN extension in between jQuery and JS, what that means is that the JavaScript library has been minified. That's a fancy way of saying that all the extra space has been taken out of the JavaScript file. Again, just to reduce the size of the JavaScript file down to the smallest thing that is still going to be interpreted correctly by the browser. We do this to reduce the amount of time that it takes to get that file across the network. If you look into it, you will see it's hard to read for a human, but it's perfectly reasonable JavaScript for the computer to compile. So in this example, we have a head and a body, and in the body we have a picture of a coffee bean apparently, and then in the head we have 2 script tags loaded remotely from Google. All right. Now when we worked with our Bootstrap template, we loaded JavaScript remotely as well. In that template that we got from the Bootstrap version 4 page, down at the bottom were 3 different script tags. And they were down at the bottom, because this is the best known practice for loading JavaScript. You put it at the end of your web page so that you're not waiting for these scripts to be downloaded while the rest of your page is able to be rendered. So in this case, we're loading 3 different libraries. That first library you can see is a remote load of a jQuery library. It's being loaded from the jQuery site itself. And so we're not using Google, we're not using our local machine, we're using jQuery to serve that file. So every time our web page opens, our browser is going to make a request to jQuery.com to get the file. In this case, you can see SLIM or Slim has been added to the name of jQuery. That's a special version of the jQuery library that doesn't have the full functionality of jQuery. Again, it's another way of reducing the file size. On top of that, it's been minified, so all the spaces have been taken out and the variable lengths have been shortened as much as possible. And because we're loading it from another website, we're including a fingerprint of that file that is associated with the integrity attribute. That fingerprint will not, let's see, so what is that? How does that work? The jQuery JavaScript file that gets downloaded will be hashed, and it will have a fingerprint taken of it. And if that fingerprint doesn't match the fingerprint associated with the integrity attribute, then your browser is not going to execute it. And this is a way to make sure that we don't have malicious code inserted into our web page. And finally, the cross-origin attribute says that it's okay to get JavaScript from another website as long as that integrity line matches. So that's the first one. The second one is also a library. It's not a jQuery library. It's another library called Tether. And the last library is a Bootstrap library itself. All right, so that's an example of loading jQuery. It's done for us in the Bootstrap template. And so you may not even need to do it. You could just cut and paste that if you need to use jQuery in one of your files. All right, that's how you get it. That's where it comes from. That's the rationale for it. But how does it actually work? Well, it is JavaScript. And when you have that library loaded in your JavaScript, when you run your code, you have access to it. And what it does is it selects HTML elements in the document object model, and it performs actions on them. The basic syntax for jQuery is that it starts with the $. The $sign looks like it's some special code or something in JavaScript, but in fact the $sign is just the name of the main jQuery function. So when we use that $sign, what we're doing is we're calling jQuery. The first parameter that we pass to jQuery is something called a selector. And that selector is going to identify which parts of the HTML document object model we want to manipulate. The .action part that follows it is an action that's applied to everything that's been selected. Just as a side note, the $sign can also be substituted with the full jQuery name if you want, but that's rarely done. Okay, so the selector is used to query elements in your HTML document object model, and then the action is something that's applied to all of those elements. So what would that look like? Well, for starters, the selector language uses the same language as CSS. So if you remember from our discussions of CSS, we had a couple examples of formatting that was placed in a separate style sheet. We had on the left there an H2, H3, A tag, and that was code that said that this font size of 200% should apply to all of the H2 and all of the H3 and all of the A tags in our HTML document. The middle example of CSS says that the color blue should be applied to all of the H1 elements in our document. And on the right, we see two different rules. One which applies to all the H1 elements, coloring it blue, giving it the Courier font family and a font size of 300%. And the other rule being applied to all P tags or all paragraphs, giving them the color red and the appropriate font and border. Again, I'm no graphic designer, but these are CSS rules that are valid. Well, when you use these same CSS rules in jQuery, you use the $ and then a selector. So in this first one behind me, what we have is we have the $, the selector, and we put H2, H3, A into our jQuery selector. That means that all of those elements in our document are going to have whatever action we choose applied to them. Now in this case, action is just a placeholder. You don't actually put action there. You change it so that it is an action that you want applied. And it can't be anything. It has to be ones that are known to the jQuery library. But in this moment, in this slide, I just want to specify the selectors. So you can see in the second case, we're using the H1 CSS selector in order to apply an action. And then in the third bullet, we're using the P tag, we're using the P CSS selector in order to identify all the P tags to which we want to apply an action. So what would this end up looking like? Well, let's say that we had the HTML that's on the upper right here. Or sorry, on the upper left. In this HTML, in this chunk of HTML, we have 3 P tags and 1 image tag. The P tags have content of words, and even more words. There's 3 elements that have the class of foo and 1 element that has the class of ID. Sorry, that has the attribute. Let's see, there's one thing whose ID attribute has the value of bar, and there are 3 things whose attribute of class has the value of foo. We know from the convention of using JavaScript, of using HTML, that whenever you have an ID, the value of that ID should be unique. Okay, so let's say that we would like to hide various elements of our document. We could use JavaScript in order to call the hide action. And by hide, that would make that element become invisible on the web page. The first example under multiple results here selects all P elements and hides them. So if you run this JavaScript code somehow in your document, in your HTML, what it's going to do, it's going to make all your P's disappear and stop being rendered. They'll still be in the document object model, but you just won't see them rendered in the browser anymore. So in the case of our code up here, that means this first element, this P hide, is actually going to make all 3 of these nodes become not visible in our document. If we take the second one, we're using the selector of .foo. Now remember, in the CSS syntax, .foo means all elements that have the class of foo. And so in this case, we're going to hide several elements. We're going to hide the first element and the last 2 elements. Even though they're different tags, there's 2 P tags and an image tag, we're selecting anything that has the class of foo, regardless of its tag. And we're going to make them all hide. So in this case, the image will go away. In the third case, we're going to select only those paragraphs that have the class of foo, in which case we're going to hide those elements. And in that case, we're selecting 2 of the P classes. So hopefully, in these examples, you can see that a clever use of the selector query and an appropriate setting of the classes and IDs in your HTML makes it possible to do very complicated manipulations of your document object model with relatively small amounts of text. As a single result, if we wanted to select just the element that has the ID of bar, we could use the #bar selector, and that would look for an element whose ID is bar and hide it. That should be just one element in our document. Finally, and so it would be hide the second one, PID bar. Finally, we can use the selector this. Now this is not a selector that's available to CSS. This is unique to jQuery, and what this refers to is it refers to the element in which this code has been placed. That's a little bit strange to describe, but basically it's a context-dependent code. And so what gets hidden when this code runs depends on where this code is placed. I'll show you an example in a second. Just like there are lots of elaborate selectors in CSS, you can use those elaborate selectors in jQuery as well. For example, you can use multiple selectors, like selecting all the P and image tags. Or you can use a descendant selector, for example, selecting all the A tags, which are a descendant of some P tag. So that's sort of setting up a path in your HTML that you want to have respected before you select an element. In the third example, you can have a sibling filter. That's going to select any element that has a .previous class as a sibling and whose class is next. So this plus sign indicates that we want two things that are sibling. And the action is going to be applied to the thing that has the class next. Finally, you have the ability to do negation in some cases as well. And so input : not parenthesis : checked is a way of specifying all of those input elements that are not checked. So these are like not radio buttons, but check boxes that maybe you want to highlight them red if they haven't been checked. It's a to-do list manager. Maybe it's a to-do list manager. You want to show the user very quickly and visually how all of the different elements that haven't been done yet, where they are. And so maybe you would apply an action to change these elements to being red, or something very aesthetically unpleasant like that. That's my specialty, aesthetically unpleasant. Some example actions that you can apply. So there's a lot of talk, I've spoken a lot about selecting elements. What actions can you apply? Well, there are lots and lots of actions, and I'm going to have you read through some documentation to get a sense of all the actions that are available. But here are some real common ones. You can append some content to a document object model. So if you have a p tag, for example, and you select it, and then the action is to append something, well, within the parameters of the append function, you would put the code that you want to append. So you could make a child paragraph within another paragraph. Or you could put an image within a paragraph tag. Something like that. You can also wrap content around a document object model. This is a little funky, but what it means is that you're going to select something, like a paragraph perhaps, and you're going to push it down and make it a child of the thing that you pass into the wrap function. So maybe you want to push it into a div, or you want to make an existing paragraph be a child of another paragraph. Another thing that you could do is you can toggle the display of a document object model. So maybe you have things that you want to appear or disappear. For example, maybe you want to enable chat, or maybe you have a notification icon, and you want that notification icon to show up at some point when a message is delivered from a WebSocket. You could use the toggle command in order to first select the element you want to see, and then toggle whether it's on or off. You can also attach functions to elements. And so you can leave a little bit of JavaScript code, and you can use jQuery in order to attach that function to, say, an element when you hover over it, so that as your mouse moves over the element, you'll run some kind of JavaScript code. And finally, you can request remote data from another website using the AJAX pattern if you want. So here's an example of this in action. So this is an example of a very simple HTML page. You can see that there's a head and a body. And in the body, there's one image, and the image is of a coffee bean. In the head, we have our script tags. Our script tags are being loaded from Google. And then we have a third script tag in which we're doing some jQuery work. You can see the $, and so the $, means that what's about to follow is a jQuery function. And what we're passing to the selector is the document. So it turns out in this case, what we're doing is we're applying something to the entire document. The action that we're using is the ready action. What this does is anything that we pass to the document ready function is going to be executed, any function we pass it is going to be executed once all of the content from the web page has been loaded from all the remote sources. So we're going to give it a function. And so what are we going to do when all the content has been loaded into our document? Well, we're going to do some more jQuery. Once all the content has been loaded, our function gets run, and now we're going to select all of the image tags in our document, and we're going to attach a function to the click event. So after everything's been loaded, we'll go through the document, find all the images, and we'll attach a function to it that says that when this element is clicked on, and so here you can see I'm using the jQuery this selector, and because it's embedded within a function that's selecting image, it's going to apply to the image. And what this is going to do is anytime I click on an image, it's going to cause the image to hide, but it's going to use an animation called blind in order to do that. So let's take a look at what that would look like. Here's an example of the heart coffee bean, and when I click on it, you can see that jQuery does a blind fade, and horizontal is the direction, and then 5,000 milliseconds is how long it takes. All right, likewise, I could do a very similar example, But rather than having the function that's attached to the click event be to do the hide animation with a blind effect, I'm going to do the hide animation with an explode effect with 5-second duration. And that's going to look like this. You click on it, it's going to break apart into 9 pieces and fade off into the sunset. Okay, in those cases, what I was doing is I was selecting the image tag, but only one image was present. Here's an example where in the body of my document, I actually have 2 image tags. The same thing, but 2 different images. And yet, in my jQuery ready function, when everything has been loaded and I execute the function that's in the ready action, you can see I'm selecting all the image tags, and now there are 2 image tags. So for each of those image tags, I'm going to attach a function that causes the elements to hide when they are clicked on, using the horizontal effect. So now in my HTML document, I have 2 hearts, and when I click on the top one, it causes that one to go away. And once it's fully gone away, my document re-renders, and when I click on the other one, it also goes away. And it really goes away, so all the flow around the elements, gets rerouted with the fact that the first heart has disappeared. All right, so there's a lot more to learn, and so I will send you off to do some reading on the jQuery website in order to get familiar with some of the possibilities that are available to you. jQuery is also a fast-moving library, so it changes quite a bit, and so there's always things that are a little bit different in each version that comes out, but it's a great, very powerful library in general. Now, we've actually used it already in our code, so I just want to point out 2 places where we have used it. Here's an example of us doing something when the document is ready, and this is a different syntax for it. But what you can see is that there's a $sign in our code, and then we have this function that we're being passed, and this was the code that was in our reverse I application, and this was what happened when our document first loaded. It caused our client, this is our client's code, caused our client to join a chat room. Well, here's the previous template of the way that we would run a function when our document was loaded. Document ready, and then that function that's in teal there would be run. What we did in our version was just a little shortcut. It's possible to just say $sign function and then pass the contents of the function that we want to run when our document is loaded in this format as well. So in our code, what you can see is that we have said that when all the elements in our document are done being loaded, then we want to create a variable called payload and initialize it to an empty object. Set the room member of our payload object equal to chat room. Set the username member of our payload object to be equal to the username variable. Then send a message to our console log. And then finally emit a message to our socket saying that we've joined a room with the payload attached. So these are all things that will happen after our document is fully loaded. So again, we're going to run this code, whatever code we put in there, when everything on the web page has loaded. Here's another example of something that we saw in our client code when that used jQuery. We had this little bit of code here, and what this did was it executed some code when a response was received from our server saying that someone had joined, saying that someone had joined a chat room. We would get called, our function would get called, and if the payload result was not equal to fail, we had a little $sign there that said $hashtag messages. Well, here we're using just the really standard way of using jQuery calls. We have a selector and an action. Well, what is our selector? In this case, our selector is all of the elements in our document that have the ID messages, or hashtag messages as the CSS selector. Where was that? Well, we had set up a particular location in our HTML page where we had a div whose ID was messages. And basically what we did is we just put a placeholder in our HTML so that as messages came in from the server, we could put them, there was some place to put them in the document object model. So our selector was hashtag messages, and the action that we used was append. So every time we got a message in from our server saying that we had a response to our join room request, we would add another paragraph tag to our document. And in this case, we would present the name of the user that had just joined the room. So that's a little bit of jQuery in action. And there was another bit of jQuery that I'm not going to put on the slides, in which we did the same thing whenever we received a chat message. We would put the contents of the chat message into our div whose ID was messages. In this case, our action was append. That was the action, and our selector was hashtag messages. The thing that we appended was the string that started with P and said new user, etc. It was a paragraph node. All right. So in summary, our web application and most web applications break the concerns down into those of content, presentation, and interactivity. And those are addressed with separate languages, HTML and syntax, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And to make the JavaScript a little bit easier, we introduced the jQuery library. Many websites use the jQuery library because it's so helpful in making things standard across multiple browsers. And just, it's easier. The syntax makes it very easy to do simple things in your website, even complicated things. In summary, JavaScript adds interactivity to web pages. And jQuery is a library, once you're running JavaScript, that makes it easier by providing a simple syntax and powerful actions that manipulate the document object model. Thank you for your attention.